Right now in F1, it seems like every single weekend we're talking about Perez and Stroll for all of the wrong reasons. Even though on paper Logan Sargeant is perhaps having an even worse season, in reality when you take into account what's expected of them, Stroll and Perez stand out right now, and if anything I actually think it's getting worse and worse as this long season has gone on, because clearly the pressure is mounting even more. As usual, getting the thoughts of fans is something that I like to incorporate into my videos, and so over on my Twitter I asked who so far has had a worse season. After 5,000 votes, rather unsurprisingly, it's pretty close between the two of them, with Lance coming out on top with 56% of the vote, and Checo not far behind. Looking at how close the vote is, and also reading some of your comments, it's clear that there is no majority consensus, but if anything, I think it just reflects even more how both of these drivers are almost pushing each other down in the eyes of the fans. Qatar was yet another bad weekend for both, with Sergio Perez failing to make Q3 in qualifying, crashing out during the sprint in a racing incident, and then only recovering to 10th in the Grand Prix after he was hit with three 5-second time penalties for extending track limits, and all on a weekend where his teammate wrapped up his third title with 6 races to go. In a strange way, I think Lance had perhaps an even worse weekend, getting knocked out of Q1, finishing last in the sprint, and then dropping out of the points at the end of the race after he was hit with 2 5-second time penalties for track limits. However, what Lance did on track was almost irrelevant because it was off track where he made all of the headlines. At the end of Q1, he was first seen throwing his steering wheel out of the car, which, considering those things are worth $50,000 on the low end, was a pretty reckless thing to do by itself. And then, although his trainer Henry Howe was trying to indicate that Lance needed to leave out of the front of the garage to get way to Parc Ferme, which is protocol, a frustrated Stroll walked to the back of the garage instead and was seen physically pushing his trainer for an unknown reason. The antics also didn't end there because in the post-quali interview he said no more than 7 words to 3 different questions and basically gave off the vibe of someone who was yes frustrated, but also too petulant to at least give some basic answers to totally fair questions. It must be said that the FIA compliance officer has actually stepped in after the weekend, saying the incidents may have contravened FIA rules, policies and procedures. Although as of recording we still don't know yet if there's going to be any repercussions going forward. And now after the incident, Aston Martin's PR machine Mike Crack came out in defense of his driver, surprise surprise, saying, "Emotions is what we want from sportsmen, and then if they react, we judge them quickly. Is this right? Is this wrong? We need to be careful with that. We want to see it because then we have something to talk about, but I think it goes one step too far that people sit down on a sofa or in an air-conditioned room and say, this is too much or you cannot do that. I think we need to have a bit more respect for the drivers." And now, look, I like Mike Crack. He seems like a very level-headed guy, and I think for the most part, he has done a decent job during his time at Aston Martin. But to me, it's very clear that so far his approach with Stroll has basically been zero accountability and zero criticism. So almost the opposite of Red Bull. Even after his Singapore qualifying crash, Crack came out and said that it was a sign of his full commitment, which to me was one of the most ridiculous things I've ever heard. For whatever reason, and I think his dad owning the team is a big one, Crack's approach to Stroll's mistakes have been total deflection of any blame or wrongdoing. And now don't get me wrong, constantly piling in on your driver, especially in the media, is also not the way to go, but there's got to be a healthy balance between the arm around the shoulder approach and the kick up the backside approach. Putting what happened after qualifying down to emotions and adrenaline, to me is just not right. Yes, drivers run on levels of adrenaline that we as fans can't even comprehend, but that isn't an excuse to cross the line and start being physical with a member of your team. I mean, take Checo as an example. All season long, he has been getting slaughtered for underperforming by fans on social media, journalists, pundits, content creators like me, and even his own team. In Qatar, as I mentioned, he had yet another bad qualifying, not making it into Q3, and yet despite that, he got out of the car with no drama, went over to the interview pen and faced up to the scrutiny of the media like a professional. Checo, I'm sure, was just as frustrated as Stroll was, but it didn't give him an excuse to act in the same way. Both Checo and Lance are massively experienced drivers. Despite Lance being just 24 years old, out of the 775 drivers that have raced in Formula 1, Lance Stroll is actually the 49th most experienced driver in F1 history, with Checo up there in 11th in terms of all-time starts. These drivers are experienced and mature enough to be able to control their own emotions, and that's why, even though I understand Stroll's frustration, Checo, in an even more stressful environment, is showing that you don't have to let yourself cross that line. The struggles of both of these drivers is compounded massively by the fact that they each have, in my opinion, top tier teammates in the other car. If you saw the video that I did recently where I ranked each driver using a tier list, the same video in which I clearly underrated Oscar Piastri given what happened in Qatar, you'll know that to me, there is only 3 drivers who I comfortably put in the absolute top tier of Formula 1, and both Verstappen and Alonso are absolutely in that tier. When you look at the average qualifying gap over the first 17 races, Checo has been over 6/10 slower than Max, with Lance just over 5/10 slower than Fernando. What really stood out to me, however, was that whenever the conditions got wet, the gap to both teammates shot up almost consistently over 1 second. In terms of when it matters on a Sunday though, when you look at the percentage of points that each of the driver has contributed to their team, Checo has scored 34.1% of Red Bull's total points, with Lance shockingly contributing just 20.4% of Aston Martin's points. Now, just to give some context, I consider anything below 37 or 36% to be pretty worrying, especially for a driver that's massively experienced. But in the case of Lance, apart from Logan Sargeant, who's not scored any points yet, Lance has contributed the least number of points relative to his teammate on the grid, even less than Zhou, Piastri and Lawson, with one of them being a second-year driver and the other 2 being rookies. From Checo's side, he thinks the reason for his struggles compared to the beginning of the season has been down to the consistency of the car, saying, "I think just having a more consistent base throughout the season and having a car that doesn't change as much through the year will definitely be quite beneficial to be able to be more consistent with the car. As we started to develop the car, it felt like the car went away from me and I had to start always chasing the balance and compromise. I was having to make compromises here and there." And now, what's quite interesting is that actually goes against what Horner says Checo's problems have been, which is more down to a mental struggle. And nothing's really fundamentally changed that much. I think you can see he's gone into a bit of a spiral, and you can see he needs to put the brakes on that, reset, use this period to come back in Austin, another sprint weekend, and really attack it and do the best that he can to extract the most out of himself, like he was at the beginning of the year. We really need Checo to get into that window because, not this year so much, but next year, we need him to fire on all cylinders. This is one of those situations where I'm actually more on Christian Horner's side. Even though this year's cars, due to a change in the Pirelli tyres, and just the general development of the car could be the sole explanation to Checo's struggles, I'm just not buying it. I honestly think that his recent bad form has been mainly down to a mental struggle with pressure. So much of elite sport is what happens inside your head, and as Horner said, once you get into that spiral in Formula 1 of bad result pressure, it's difficult to get out of it, especially if you then try to force the issue and start pushing too much, which can lead to mistakes. Checo showed at the start of the season that he can deliver good results in the RB19. It's not as if there is absolutely no evidence whatsoever. But right now, I think the sooner the season ends and he can just have that mental restart and get away from all of these constant races, the better I think it will be for him. The problem for Red Bull and Checo, as Horner pointed out, is not this year, it's next. That is why the team already started to make contingency plans by bringing in Daniel Ricciardo into the fold, and that is why, although I do think Checo will definitely be a Red Bull driver in Bahrain 2024, if the other teams get closer and Checo starts costing the team in the constructors, there is a good chance that he won't be a Red Bull driver by Abu Dhabi 2024. At Aston Martin, it's been a lot more difficult to gauge Stroll's level and pinpoint what he's actually struggling with because the performance of the car has fluctuated throughout the season. The only constant has been Fernando because he has been just as good and just as consistent the entire season. He's reached Q3 in every single race and scored points in all but one. Stroll, on the other hand, has been consistently inconsistent. Aston Martin's struggles have been put down mostly to a slight change in Pirelli tyre spec around Silverstone, their lack of successful development, and then mostly teams like McLaren and Ferrari getting back to the level they should have been at from the beginning of the season. The problem is that the Aston Martin, even now, is not a hopeless car. As I said, Fernando has reached Q3 in every single race. He was on the podium as recently as Zandvoort, whilst Lance, particularly in qualifying recently, has made it look like one of the worst cars on the grid, qualifying in 17th, last and last in the previous 4 races. When I sat down to decide who I think has been worse so far, it didn't take me long to land on Lance Stroll. The main difference is that Checo this season has actually proven and shown that he can deliver. Even if not always for a win, on many occasions he's still been able to recover from bad qualifyings and still get back to where the car belongs on the podium. Whilst with Lance, there's just been nothing. No highlight races, no glimpses of any real quality when it mattered. I mean, even Lance's highest finish of the season of 4th in Australia, let's not forget that had the race result not been taken on countback, he wouldn't have even been in the points because he put his car in the gravel on the final restart. Other than that, Spain, where he outqualified and finished in 6th ahead of Alonso, probably stands out as his next best result, but when your teammate has scored 7 podiums and you've only finished in the points 8 times, I just don't know how to put a positive spin on that ahead of what Perez has done under more pressure. And now, don't get me wrong, Checo has been massively lucky because the team's car advantage has been so great that his poor results haven't actually cost the team in the constructors. Whilst with Stroll, once McLaren overtakes Aston Martin, which even Fernando Alonso basically said was inevitable, he is going to be the reason why the team loses out on 4th, 3rd, maybe even 2nd in the constructors. And when you consider that each place is worth around £10 million, that is upwards of £30 million that Stroll is costing the team because he is just not good enough to perform at that level. And that is the very definition of putting a price on failure. Well, there you have it. If you did enjoy this video and want to support the channel, then don't forget to subscribe. That would be massively appreciated, and I'll see you in the next one.